A wealthy tourist laughed at a quiet man in worn-out shoes, mocking him in front of a crowd. He had no idea he was insulting Keanu Reeves, one of the most respected stars in the world. What happened next was so powerful. It left everyone speechless. Keanu Reeves had always preferred the quiet corners of the world. While others sought red carpets and flashing lights, he found peace in cobbled streets, tucked-away cafes, and the kind of towns where time moved a little slower. It was in one of these places, a sun-drenched European village nestled between green hills, that he had decided to spend a few days away from everything. No security, no schedule, no spotlight. Just him, a journal, a dog-eared novel, and the kind of stillness that healed the soul. He blended in effortlessly. Wore the same black jeans he'd had for years, a soft gray t-shirt and a pair of scuffed, well-worn leather boots that had walked through more countries than most people could name. He didn't care for appearances. Never had. It was part of what made him Keanu. That afternoon he strolled through the main square, enjoying the smell of fresh bread and lavender drifting from nearby bakeries. He stopped to watch a group of children chasing pigeons, laughing, unaware of the world's chaos beyond their village. He smiled to himself, tucked his hands into his pockets, and kept walking. Then came the noise. A sleek black tour bus pulled into the narrow street, looking absurdly out of place. From it poured a crowd of flashy tourists, loud voices, expensive sunglasses, camera flashes everywhere. Their clothes screamed luxury, logo-covered jackets, shoes polished to a mirror shine, watches that glittered in the sun. It wasn't their presence that bothered Keanu, it was their energy. They didn't observe. They announced themselves. He stepped to the side of the street to let them pass, nodding politely to a woman who bumped his shoulder without apology. Then came the voice. Hey man, do they sell shoes here? Or did you just crawl out of a cave?" The words were loud, too loud. The crowd turned, a few chuckling in confusion. The man who'd spoken, a broad-shouldered, tanned tourist in a designer polo, was pointing directly at Keanu's boots. His wife smirked beside him, adjusting her Gucci shades. Keanu blinked. For a second he thought the man must be joking. But no, his tone was mocking, his grin wide and proud, as if he'd scored a punchline at someone else's expense. "Seriously, bro, those things look like they fought in a war and lost. You live here, or are you just surviving?" A few of the others laughed, though awkwardly. One woman nudged the man, whispering, "Leave him alone," but he brushed her off. The cameras were already back up, people snapping selfies with the village fountain, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a stranger being mocked for no reason. Keanu could have said a dozen things. Could have told the man who he was, reminded him that he was a millionaire many times over, that the boots in question had once walked through the sets of films that grossed billions worldwide. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at the man for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Have a good day," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the man confused, and for some reason, slightly unsettled. He found himself at a small cafe tucked just off the main street. It was quiet, with flower boxes in the windows and only 2 tables outside. He sat down and pulled out a notebook, flipping to a half-filled page. But before he could write, someone appeared at his table. It was a young woman, maybe mid-30s, with flour on her apron and kind eyes. "I saw what happened," she said softly, placing a glass of water in front of him. "People like that, they never look past the surface." Keanu smiled at her, genuinely touched. "Thanks," he said. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "You carried yourself with more dignity than most people I've ever met." He ordered coffee and stayed for over an hour. They talked about books, the rhythm of village life, and the cafe's history. Her grandmother had opened it after the war. She never asked who he was. She didn't need to. She just saw him. And for Keanu, that was enough. Back in the square, the tourist continued barking orders at his group, trying to rally them for a group photo. But a few of them kept glancing down the road where the man he had mocked had disappeared, their smiles more subdued now. The tourist didn't realize that he'd made himself the fool. Not because he didn't recognize a celebrity, but because he couldn't recognize decency when it stood quietly in front of him. What he saw as just a man in old shoes had turned out to be one of the most respected names in the world. And the truth, it hadn't even needed to be spoken to leave him frozen. The square had grown busier since Keanu's quiet arrival. The sun was now high above the red-tiled rooftops, casting long shadows across the cobbled stones. Children played near the edge of the fountain, their laughter echoing off the old brick buildings. Tourists filled the cafes and clustered around the local market stalls, their voices buzzing like a hive. Keanu stood near a corner, casually observing the rhythm of the village. He didn't seek attention, never had. His clothes were simple black jeans, a faded shirt, and the same old boots that had carried him through years of film sets, long walks, and quiet mornings like this one. He blended in. That's what he liked. But blending in didn't protect him that day. From across the square, the loud voice of the tourist returned, this time louder, more pointed, and now directed entirely at Keanu. The man had noticed that his earlier taunt hadn't earned him the reaction he wanted, and when people like him didn't get attention through charm, they turned to cruelty. Hey, the man called, his voice rising over the chatter of the crowd. You again? Are you still wandering around? Lost, maybe? Keanu didn't look up right away. He was browsing a vendor's collection of second-hand books, quietly flipping through a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. The tourist took that as an invitation. Look, I'm serious. You okay, man? Need a few euros? I mean, he laughed loudly and gestured to Keanu's boots. Those things look like they're older than this whole town. What are you, some local stray? Laughter erupted, not from everyone, but from enough people that it cut through the air like a blade. A group of younger tourists nearby smirked behind their phones. Others shifted uncomfortably. A couple, seated at a cafe table, exchanged glances and muttered in a language Keanu didn't understand. But the discomfort in their faces needed no translation. Keanu finally looked up. His expression was unreadable. Calm. Neutral. The way someone might look at a storm in the distance, aware of its presence, but not afraid of its power. He said nothing. The tourist took a few steps closer, now fully enjoying the attention he'd gathered. You from here? You look like you sleep on benches, man. Or maybe just hanging around hoping to get discovered by Hollywood. Huh? That was the moment the crowd shifted, not physically, but in energy. A few people had begun to realize who the man was talking to. A couple of phones slowly lowered. Whispered guesses passed from person to person. Is that Keanu Reeves? The tourist didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in the sound of his own voice. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or did the shoe polish budget run out last year? Keanu finally gave a small shrug. I like these shoes, he said quietly. The tourist raised his eyebrows and barked out another laugh. Of course you do. I'm sure they've got character or whatever. But come on. You're in public, man. At least try to look like you belong here. It was then that someone else decided she'd had enough. A woman stepped forward from the entrance of a nearby cafe. She wore a flower-streaked apron and held a dish towel in one hand. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she had the look of someone who didn't raise her voice unless she absolutely had to. Her name was Emily. She didn't know exactly why, but something about the man's cruelty made her blood boil. That's enough, she said, loud enough to stop several people mid-bite. The tourist blinked and turned. Excuse me? I said. That's enough, Emily repeated, stepping toward Keanu. He's done nothing to you. You're the only one here embarrassing yourself. The tourist gave a mocking laugh. Oh, I see. You're the waitress, right? That explains it. I'm not just the waitress, she replied calmly. I'm someone who was raised to treat strangers with kindness. The man scoffed, but for the first time his smirk faltered. Emily turned to Keanu and smiled gently. Would you like to come inside? She asked. We've got coffee, and no one's going to comment on your shoes in there. Keanu looked at her for a moment, then gave a quiet nod. That sounds nice. They walked toward the cafe together, the crowd parting for them. As they disappeared through the doorway, the square seemed suddenly quieter. The tourist stood awkwardly in the center, his moment of dominance now twisted into something else entirely. Round around, expecting laughter, validation, even applause. But the expressions he met were distant, cold, some even disapproving. No one followed him for selfies. No one seemed impressed. And, though he couldn't explain it, he felt something unfamiliar crawling into his chest. Shame. He had tried to humiliate a stranger, and in doing so, he had humiliated himself. All because he didn't see what others had just begun to realize. The man he mocked wasn't some lost traveler. He was Keanu Reeves, and he hadn't needed to say a word to show the world who he truly was. The cafe door swung gently closed behind them, muffling the murmur of the village square. The sound of clinking cutlery and the warm scent of coffee welcomed Keanu like a soft blanket. He stood by the entrance for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimmer light. Emily moved behind the counter with the ease of someone who had worked the space for years, grabbing 2 cups and reaching for the coffee pot. Without saying a word. "Take any seat you like," she said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. "It's quieter in here." Keanu gave her a small nod and chose a window seat tucked in the corner. It overlooked the square, where the tourists still stood, confused and agitated, looking around as though expecting an audience that had long since lost interest. The man's voice was no longer loud. His bravado had melted into embarrassment. A moment later, Emily slid into the seat across from Keanu and placed a steaming cup in front of him. "On the house," she said. "You didn't have to do that." Keanu replied gently. "I know," she said, "but you didn't deserve what just happened out there." Keanu paused, wrapping his hands around the cup, appreciating the warmth. "It happens," he said quietly. "Some people, they only see what's on the surface." Emily tilted her head, studying him. "You handled it well. Most people would have snapped." "I mean, I almost did." He offered a faint smile. "There's no use adding fire to a fire. I found that quiet tends to sting more than shouting." Emily chuckled. "That's one way to put it." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Outside, life resumed. The fountain gurgled. Children chased pigeons. The tourist bus engine rumbled as it prepared to leave, and just like that, the man who had made a fool of himself would become another forgotten Pasurbi. But the moment how it made people feel would linger. Keanu glanced at Emily. "Thank you for stepping in." She shrugged. "I couldn't just stand there. It was ugly. And honestly, you didn't seem like the kind of person who would defend himself that way." "I'm not," he admitted. "Not anymore." "Anymore?" she asked, intrigued. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned the conversation. "Have you always lived here?" Emily smiled. "Born and raised. My grandmother started this cafe. I used to help her wash cups when I was barely tall enough to reach the sink. I left for a few years, tried the city life. But something about this place kept pulling me back." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. Cities have speed, but not much soul. Places like this, they breathe differently." She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "You travel a lot?" He paused. "Enough to know that the world is full of people who wear wealth like armor, and that kindness, when it shows up, feels like sunlight in a storm." Emily looked at him curiously, the edges of her lips curling into a knowing smile. "You speak like someone who's seen both sides of life." Keanu met her eyes. There was no arrogance, no desire to impress, just a quiet truth in his expression. "Maybe I have," he said. She narrowed her eyes, playfully. "You're not one of those wandering poets, are you? The ones who drink black coffee and write in journals at train stations?" Keanu laughed genuinely softly. "Not a poet. Not exactly." "Well, whatever you are," she said, rising from the table. "I'm glad you stopped by." "So am I," he replied. As she returned behind the counter to help a customer, Keanu gazed out the window again. The square had calmed. The noisy tourist group was gone, leaving behind nothing but a faint trail of perfume and entitlement. The silence that followed felt clean. He took another sip of coffee, then stood up and walked slowly to the counter. Emily was scribbling something on a receipt pad. She looked up as he approached. "Heading out?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "But thank you for the coffee. And for seeing me." She raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it's rare." He hesitated. "More than you'd think." And with that, he left the cafe, stepping back into the sunshine, blending into the rhythm of the village. Once more. Emily watched him go, a strange thought nudging at the back of her mind. There was something familiar in the way he walked, something in the stillness he carried. But she couldn't quite place it. Then she shrugged, returning to her customers with a small smile. She didn't need to know his name. His character had already spoken louder than any introduction ever could. The village square had transformed by late afternoon. Wooden stalls lined the cobbled paths, draped in colorful fabrics and flower garlands. Children danced around a street musician, and the smell of roasting chestnuts and sweet pastries filled the air. Laughter echoed, wine glasses clinked, and the sun had started its slow descent over the red rooftops. It was the town's annual summer festival, a day meant to honor local history, community efforts, and the quiet heroes who supported the village behind the scenes. The tourist hadn't planned to stay. After the awkward moment earlier, he'd intended to head back to the bus, maybe drown his embarrassment in a glass of something expensive. But curiosity, along with the quiet tension of knowing he'd made a public fool of himself, kept him wandering. He wanted distraction, something to take his mind off the man in the worn boots, who, without a single insult or raised voice, made him feel like the smallest person in the square. He found himself standing near the fountain again, half watching as the townspeople gathered around a small stage set up at the far end. There was a low hum of excitement, and the tourists who had remained began crowding in, raising their phones to record what looked like the opening ceremony. A local official in a tan blazer stepped onto the platform, tapping the microphone with a grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man began, "thank you for joining us on this special day. As you know, this festival celebrates not just our culture, but the people who keep it alive, especially those who give not for praise, but out of quiet kindness." The tourist sipped from a wine glass, unimpressed. Another speech. Another round of applause for someone who probably donated a bench or bought a new roof for the bakery. He turned, already half distracted, until the official continued. "Today, we have the honor of recognizing someone very special. Someone who, over the last 5 years, has quietly funded scholarships for our students, helped rebuild our community library after the flood, and supported local shelters without ever asking for credit." There was a shift in the air. The crowd leaned in. The tourist narrowed his eyes, now paying full attention. This person never asked to be named. In fact, we were forbidden to mention him for years. But today he finally agreed on one condition: that the recognition be about the village, not about him. The official smiled and turned slightly. "So please help me thank someone whose heart is bigger than any film role or fortune. Mr. Keanu Reeves." The name hit the air like thunder rolling across a silent lake. Gasps rose from the crowd, followed by stunned applause. People looked around, searching for him, craning their necks and pointing toward the back of the crowd where a quiet figure had just stepped forward, the man with the old boots. Keanu walked to the stage slowly, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed as if hoping he could walk through the applause instead of standing in it. But the crowd surged around him, cheering, clapping, whispering his name. A child tugged at his coat and offered him a small flower, which he accepted with a gentle smile. The same smile, the same calm demeanor from earlier that day, only now the village saw the full picture. The tourist's wine glass nearly slipped from his hand. His face turned a pale, sickly shade. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. He watched, frozen, as the man he had mocked for looking poor, for wearing worn-out boots, for not belonging in a public space, was now being applauded by hundreds of people for his generosity, humility, and grace. And not just any man. Keanu Reeves, a list actor, global icon, and evidently the most down-to-earth human being he'd ever encountered, and insulted. A lump formed in his throat. His earlier bravado now felt ridiculous. The jokes, the sneering comments, the mocking laughter, it all echoed in his mind, louder than the applause. As Keanu reached the microphone, the clapping quieted. He looked out over the crowd, eyes soft, voice low. "I didn't do any of this for attention," he began. "I've been lucky in life, and when you're lucky, you give back. This town, it gave me peace when I needed it. So this," he gestured around him, "this is yours. I'm just grateful to be a part of it." He didn't speak long. A few more words, a few thanks. Then he stepped aside, letting the celebration move on, refusing to steal the spotlight. But the moment had done its work. The tourist turned, slowly backing away from the crowd. No one looked at him. No one needed to. His shame was enough to fill the entire square. He saw Emily across the plaza, handing out pastries to children. She caught his eye for the briefest second. There was no smile, no smirk, just a quiet, knowing glance before she turned her back and walked away. And he understood. This wasn't just about mocking a stranger. T was about what kind of person he had chosen to be when he thought no one important was watching. And the truth was, someone always iced. The music played on, bright and joyful, as the village festival reached its lively peak. Children spun in dizzy circles near the fountain, vendors handed out pastries with powdered sugar on top, and neighbors greeted each other like old friends. But not everyone shared in the warmth of the celebration. Near the edge of the square, the tourist stood rooted in place, the echo of Keanu Reeves' name still ringing in his ears like a bell he couldn't unhear. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. Not because someone had belittled him, not because of a sharp insult or a public scolding, but because of the absence of all those things. The quiet, calm presence of a man he had mocked had turned into a mirror, showing him exactly who he was when no one was watching. For several long minutes he did nothing. Just watched the stage as Keanu stepped down, the applause still fading in the background. A few people moved in to shake his hand, take photos, express their thanks. Keanu accepted it all with a soft nod and a humble smile, never lingering too long in the center. He seemed to belong more with the shy boy offering him a paper flower than the crowd rushing to be near him. And it was in that contrast that the tourist began to realize just how badly he had misjudged the man. Finally, with slow, heavy steps, he approached. Not out of obligation, not to salvage pride, but because something inside him, it might have been guilt, or maybe something better, told him it was time. Keanu was walking along the edge of the square now, away from the crowd, toward the quiet alley behind the cafe where they had first crossed paths. Emily was nearby, helping clean up a few tables, her apron dusted with flour and sunlight. She turned just in time to see the tourist approach. "Hey," he called out, not loudly, but enough to draw attention. Keanu turned his head, pausing mid-step. The man hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "I didn't know. I mean, earlier at the fountain I didn't realize who you were." Keanu looked at him, his expression unreadable. The tourist tried again, searching for the right words. "I was out of line. I said some things I shouldn't have, made some assumptions. You didn't deserve that." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the sound of distant music and the clatter of plates being stacked nearby. Then Keanu nodded. "Just once. Before speaking. We all reveal who we are by how we treat people with nothing to prove. The words weren't harsh. They weren't meant to cut. But they settled deep, like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward until the truth of them reached every corner of the man's conscience. He opened his mouth to respond, but there was nothing left to say. No defense. No clever recovery. Just the weight of those words and the understanding that they would stay with him far longer than his embarrassment ever would. Emily watched from a distance, a dish in her hand, her brows slightly furrowed. She had suspected earlier, of course. There had been something about him, the way he spoke, the calm in his eyes, the way he had carried himself, not just with confidence, but with quiet care. But even knowing it now, even after hearing his name spoken from the stage, she wasn't surprised. She didn't need the fame to know the measure of the man. His humility had told her everything from the moment he stepped into her cafe and thanked her like she was the important one. Keanu gave the tourist a small nod, then turned to leave. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't pretend things were fine. But there was no bitterness in his departure, only finality. The kind of ending that didn't need applause or closure, because the lesson had already been delivered. The tourist remained standing there long after Keanu disappeared into the alley. Emily approached slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Looks like he handled it better than most would," she said quietly. The man glanced at her, eyes tired. He didn't have to say anything at all. That's what made it worse. Emily gave a small, knowing smile. That's what made it better. They stood there for a moment, just two people who had seen the best and worst of what a day could bring. Then Emily turned back toward her cafe, leaving the man to his thoughts and the sound of music drifting over the rooftops. It wasn't the revelation of Keanu's fame that shifted something in the tourist. It wasn't the cameras or the crowd or the surprise. It was the way Keanu had stood quietly in the face of cruelty and responded with grace, not because he had to, but because that's who he was. And for the first time in a very long time, the tourist realized he wanted to be remembered for something other than his wallet, his watch, or his voice. He wanted to be remembered for how he treated people, especially when there was nothing in it for him. It didn't take long. By nightfall, the sleepy village was no longer just a dot on the map for wine lovers and wanderers. It had become the center of a global conversation. A teenager from the tourist group had captured the entire interaction on her phone, starting from the mocking words near the fountain to Keanu's calm reaction, and finally the stunning moment when he was honored on stage. She hadn't meant to stir the internet into a frenzy. She just uploaded the video to her page with a simple caption: "Keanu Reeves, humiliated by rich tourist, stays silent, leaves him speechless." Hours later, within hours, the clip had spread like wildfire. Twitter exploded, Instagram Reels multiplied, TikTok edits layered dramatic music over Keanu's composed expression, cutting between the tourists' laughter and the stunned realization that followed. Comments poured in by the thousands. This man is class personified. The fact that he didn't say a word makes it hit even harder. You don't need to clap back when grace does the talking. How you treat nobodies says more about you than any brand ever will. News outlets picked up the story. Entertainment blogs, human interest columns, even international news ran headlines like, "Keanu Reeves sets the internet ablaze with a masterclass in grace." Rich tourist learns expensive lesson in humility from the world's most humble celebrity. No red carpet needed. Keanu wins the internet with old shoes and quiet power. The tourist, whose name had not been revealed, thankfully, disappeared from the conversation as fast as he had entered it. He had no statement to offer, no follow-up. And in a world obsessed with viral clapbacks and public takedowns, the internet found something even more satisfying. A moment where no revenge was needed, because dignity already did the job. Meanwhile, Emily's tiny cafe, once just a peaceful corner of the village, became an unlikely point of interest. People online tried to find it, geotag it, ask locals where the scene had happened. But Emily kept quiet. She gave one short interview to a local journalist and refused all others. "What did he say after it happened?" the journalist had asked. "Not much," Emily replied with a smile. "He just thanked me. Like I was the one who'd done something extraordinary." And that's what struck people the most. Keanu had shown that being right didn't require being loud, that you didn't need to embarrass someone publicly to prove your worth. You just needed to know it quietly and carry it like a coat you never took off, even when others tried to strip it from you. In classrooms and cafes, at dinner tables and online forums, people began talking about the story, not as gossip, but as a parable. Teachers discussed it with students during lessons about empathy. Parents shared it with their children as a reminder to lead with kindness. The lesson wasn't complicated. You never know who you're talking to, you never know who's watching, and most importantly, you always know who you are. Keanu didn't post about the incident. He didn't comment or retweet. He went on with his life, filming in quiet corners of the world, supporting local charities, slipping in and out of airports without drawing attention. But that only made the story grow. Because the moment spoke for itself. The man in old shoes hadn't just walked away from humiliation. He had walked straight into the hearts of millions, without saying a word. The festival had ended. The stalls were folded up and wheeled away, the music silenced, the lights dimmed. Morning dew clung to the edges of cafe tables as the village woke slowly, wrapped in the quiet aftermath of celebration. Emily arrived early, as she always did, to prep the coffee machines and wipe down the counters. She wasn't expecting anything unusual. The world had moved on, and so, she thought, had Keanu. But as she stepped behind the register, she noticed a small white envelope resting neatly on the countertop. No name on the front, just a folded edge and the unmistakable smooth weight of something intentional. She opened it carefully, her hands still dusted with flour from the morning pastries. Inside was a note, handwritten in calm, steady lettering. "Thank you for reminding the world that grace still exists in small corners, for treating a stranger like a human being, and for never needing to know my name to show me respect. Use this to help your cafe continue being the kind of place people find when they need to be seen." Her breath caught. She read the note twice, then turned it over to make sure she wasn't imagining it. But tucked just beneath it was a certified receipt from the local bank, A quiet transfer, made anonymously, of a sum large enough to renovate the entire cafe, pay her staff higher wages, and keep the doors open for years to come. There was no media, no post online, no fanfare, just a gift, left behind like a final thank you from a traveler passing through. Emily stood there, the note trembling slightly in her hand. She wasn't emotional by nature, but something in the quiet sincerity of it, all of it, made her eyes sting. She thought back to that first moment, when he had stepped into the cafe in worn-out boots and offered a soft thank you, like it was worth more than gold. She had treated him like anyone else, and in return, he had reminded her of something she hadn't even realized she'd forgotten, that kindness, when given freely, could ripple farther than she ever expected. She taped the note to the inside of the storage room door where the staff could see it every day. Not for praise, but as a reminder. Later that afternoon, another envelope arrived, delivered by hand from someone she didn't expect. The tourist, he looked different now, quieter. His sunglasses were gone, his shirt untucked, his shoulders no longer puffed up with ego. He didn't say much, just walked in, handed her the envelope and said, "You were right, so was he." Then he left. Inside was another receipt. A smaller donation, but no less meaningful. No signature. Just a line written on a napkin tucked inside the envelope, for the people who do more than serve coffee. For the ones who see. Emily didn't need to say anything. She just smiled and tucked the napkin into the drawer next to Keanu's note. A cafe didn't become a franchise. It didn't plaster his face across its windows or rebrand itself as Keanu's Corner. It stayed exactly as it was, quiet, honest, warm. But people began visiting more, not because they wanted a selfie, but because they'd heard whispers about a place where kindness mattered more than currency. The story of what happened in that village became a kind of quiet legend. It wasn't written into movies or turned into talk show segments. It was told in small moments, between friends, across dinner tables and cafes around the world. Because the moral had landed, real wealth isn't the label on your shoes or the watch on your wrist. It's not measured in applause or money or how many people know your name. It's in how you treat the stranger with no status, no spotlight, and nothing to give you in return. And maybe most of all, it's in how you act when you think no one's watching. But someone always is.